I really appreciate you bringing this up because I think it's ironically, we talk about student debt, but we often don't talk about how the debt impacts educational experience. And so you'll hear an argument around the morals of it, the economics of it, the politics of it, but very rarely do we actually talk about like what does this do to the educational experience of both teachers and students. And I think you kind of hinted at one way. You can trace different ways that debt messes with or makes miseducative experiences happen. And I think one way you hinted at, which is to say that once you know that debt is waiting for you in the future, you start to adopt this like return on investment approach to your education. So you start to think of education not in like, how do I make myself a more full, freer human being, but instead, how do I shape myself as human capital that's going to be able to sell myself on a market? How do I brand myself? How do I continuously be an entrepreneur of myself? And so you take on this return on investment logic and you do this, what you just mentioned. You might love poetry, you might love art, you might love philosophy, but instead you become an engineer or an investment banker because you have these debts to pay and you know that your education has to have an economic return rather than say like a social or humanistic return. And you shape your educational path that way. So as a student, you start to make these rational choices, and you can't really fault students for thinking this way because they know what's waiting for them at the end, right? This massive debt. As demoralizing as it might be to think of education this way, you kind of understand it from a rational argument. The other thing, though, to think about is the ways that this impacts teachers themselves. So the NEA has a really good study that lists just how bad the teacher debt crisis is, like K through 12 and adjuncts and faculty in higher ed. And the debt levels are astronomical. I think like average around $60,000 for the average teacher teaching in K through 12. That's crazy. When we think of it though, like how does that impact how they teach? All sorts of interesting things start to become uncovered. So as Thomas said, like debt is a disciplining mechanism. If you're in major debt and you're at a school where you think you need to be teaching, maybe it's critical race theory or some other controversial topic, but you are afraid that you're going to lose your job and then not be able to pay your debts, that has disciplined how you teach in the classroom. Maybe it keeps you from speaking up. Maybe it keeps you from assigning certain assignments, reading certain books, because you're afraid that if you lose your job, you're screwed. And so it disciplines the teachers this way. Last point about this is that I think one of the things that we're seeing more and more is that education K through 12 up until higher ed becomes a process of socialization into the debt economy. In other words, from a very early age, kids are socialized into taking the role of debtors. And this actually happens. You brought up like something you mentioned in previous programs of yours. If you look at the way report cards and grades are structured, it's almost identical to credit reports. Both the credit report and the report card will give you an evaluation where you get like a letter or a number score based on the amount of work you do in a specific amount of time. As a student, you accumulate credits. So there's all sorts of ways where from a very early age, the grading system report cards are socializing students into the debt economy. In other words, how to be an obedient debtor, how to meet the demands of the creditor. And over the years, this then ends up serving people in power, i.e., creditors. And so there's just all sorts of different ways in which the material reality of financial debt starts to impact the educational reality of what happens in our classrooms and the ways that we learn and teach. And I think that's something that really, as a audience that you have a lot of teachers with, I really hope that teachers can start to think about like this question: how is the debt that I owe, or perhaps my students might owe, or their parents might owe, how is that changing what we teach and learn in classrooms?